Hi, good
Wasn't so
evening.
bad.
Thank you, Sam, for the invitation. My name is Kezia McKeague. I am with the Latin America team at McLarty Associates, which is a DC-based firm that essentially does private sector diplomacy. I work with diverse sectors, but I'm spending a lot of time these days on the mining sector. In full transparency, I advise two major multinational mining companies with their investments in Argentina in particular. Of course, critical minerals is a hot topic in Washington these days. Congratulations, Sam, on choosing a very critically important topic for the United States. Your film, to me, was fascinating, a fascinating look at the geopolitics of this issue, but also the impact on local communities around the world. You've invited two Latin Americanists, my former colleague Eric Farnsworth, the head of the Washington office of the Council of the Americas, an organization also focused on Latin America. Of course, this film touches on many parts of the world, but a real focus, very interesting one on Bolivia and Chile, part of the Lithium Triangle of South America. Why don't I start with you and just to give us a little bit of synopsis of how, I guess, your takeaways from the filming process, and also because you interviewed two former Biden administration officials, and we're now in a very different time in Washington, is a second question on whether you think things are changing under the new administration on this particular policy topic.
Yeah, those are great questions, and thank you again to everybody. I know it's not an easy documentary to watch, so I'm very appreciative to this audience. You know, what we did was, the challenge here is we really kind of pop around the world, and we don't give you a whole lot of time to relax and enjoy the scenery. You know, it's pretty dense, and hopefully it pays off, but it's a demanding documentary. I frequently say, it's not Fast and Furious, you know, so I appreciate this audience, and thank you very much. And you're right about the topic being critically important. This was really our executive director who was in this meeting with Eric, where we sat down and talked about this. And our executive director at the Bertelsmann Foundation, Irene Brom, said, wow, this sounds like it's going to be a big deal. And she was absolutely right. And we knew that when we started it, we knew that there was just going to be all sorts of changes. I mean, especially the way that things move nowadays. There's changes every single day. So I wanted to be able to approach it in a way it would still be relevant no matter what happened in Chile. You know, they were in the middle of announcing major reforms in Chile, or what happens in Bolivia as they award contracts, or of course what happens in the United States. So we wanted to find a way to talk about this from a bird's eye perspective in a way that would maintain relevance, and that's what we tried to do. But you're right, there has been an administration change. And it's not entirely clear what the new approach will be. What I can tell you about the old approach, which I think was the kind of traditional American approach, which, by the way, Washington realizes that they're getting beat right now in this race, that they're losing to China, and that's very concerning for them. And the way they tried to compete in the past was on quality. So whereas China might show up and say, here's a big sum of money, we're not going to ask for a lot of transparency, we're not going to ask for a lot of reforms, we're not going to ask for a lot of labor standards or environmental standards, just give us the minerals when you're done. The United States would try to come and say, well, look, if you work with us, we're going to do it more sustainable. If you work with us, we're going to have a better labor environment. We're going to do this better, and you can do it for longer. And I think a lot of times, though, that's not a great sell. You know, like I did another documentary in Serbia where it was clear, and in other parts of the Balkans, it was clear that the people making the decisions there were more interested in the bag of money and very few questions. Will this administration go in a different direction there? I don't think it's possible to say yet. I do think it's clear that they value critical minerals. So a lot of this kind of green stuff is being pushed to the side, I think is fair to say right now. So you would wonder, well, maybe they won't be as interested in minerals. It's clear that they do realize the concerning position they're in and want to do something about it. And yeah, I want to give you a chance. I don't want to overtalk it.
I'd agree on the bipartisan consensus on the need to reduce dependency on China, given China's dominance of the supply chain, as you so well point out in this film. Eric, any takeaways from the film? And can you talk to us about how you view the Western Hemisphere's role in that U.S. effort to reduce reliance on China?
Yeah, thanks, Kezia, and it's great to join you. It's great to join Sam. I really appreciate all of you coming and watching. I think that I learned many things in terms of watching the film, but two things I learned in the process to get to the film. Number one, Sam George is a filmmaker. And those of us who knew him before the film, I'm not sure we would have thought that, but man, you pulled it off.
I don't think I thought it
Congratulations, you've done it. And the second is when you pitch an idea, make sure it's patented beforehand so you get royalties for it, because I didn't get anything for this. I was interviewed, I didn't even get my face on the screen. So, I really got nothing here. So Sam, thanks a lot for that.
No, it's true.
But nonetheless, it's a fantastic product. And the word that keeps coming to me as I was watching it was nuanced, right? I mean, Kezia, you already referenced several things in terms of, local communities, but, these are complicated questions. And at the political level, there are a lot of interests here that have to be balanced. I mean, you mentioned geopolitical, there's economic, there's community, there's indigenous, there's history involved, there's all kinds of different things. And so these are not easy questions. And you mentioned, the complicated documentary. It's exactly right. And those are some of the questions I think people are struggling with going forward and will continue to struggle with going forward, because lithium's required for the modern economy, for energy transition, copper's required, cobalt's required. So these are things that are going to have to be mined. And the question is, how do you get from here to there? And so it leads to Kezia's question about the Western Hemisphere. And I would simply say the Western Hemisphere is extraordinarily wealthy in these products and needs to recognize the wealth that it has and find a way to capture that wealth for its own development. And I think this has been, frankly, the history of Latin America for 500 or 600 years, where others have had the benefit of the wealth, and many in Latin America have not been able to have the benefit from that. And so this idea that, the miners continue to mine and have for 500 years, and their sons and their presumably daughters as well, and generation after generation. But what's the hope? What's the opportunity for people to get to the next stage of development? And that's the whole sadness of the story that I felt. And when we talked about it initially in your and Irene's office, the idea that somehow Latin America, but developing markets generally, have to find a way to add value and capture that added value, and not just have China process it or go to somewhere else and capture the value, and at the end of the day, the supply chain value is captured by somebody else who has perhaps no connection at all to the original material. So you brought that out really well. It's not a Latin America thing, it's a global thing, but it clearly has relevance to Latin America.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I'd like to take any questions you may have, because I'm sure you do have some. I saw these two hands. Why don't we start here?
Thank you. It was a very provocative film. If I could ask you a question about the last hopeful part of the movie, which is very nice to see here. What proportion of the recycled critical minerals at this point constitute the supply, number one? And at what point in the future a balance might be reached where we could just recycle and not have to extract more?
Excellent question, because you're right. We kind of drag you through the rubble for 57 minutes and then give the 3-minute breath of hope. So there's two dynamics at play here. First of all, it is possible. It is possible to recycle these batteries and maintain fully the lithium, the nickel, the cobalt that does not degrade. There's two principal challenges we face. The first is cost efficiency. So it's not just being able to do it, but being able to do it in a way that's cheaper than mining it and bringing it in. And I think that's a major challenge right now, and it's like a cutthroat competition with different sort of shops trying to figure it out first. And that was one of the harder places to get into to film, because they were afraid I was, going to steal their secrets, even if by accident, just by filming the process could reveal something. So that, I suspect they'll figure it out, but that is a challenge right now. I don't think right now it's clearly cheaper. So that's still a riddle they're trying to solve. Now, let's say they solve that. The next challenge is getting enough of it, and that's going to take time. So the estimates I've seen is you're talking 20 to 30 years. Maybe there's other estimates that others are familiar with, but from what I understand, to gather enough, we're still early as in generating this kind of battery waste. We're still kind of early in the process, and it would take some time to get to that level.
Please, right here.
Yeah, question number one, how long did it take you to make this
microphone.
documentary? Who's funding it? Question number two, is it one of many series? Because what struck me is we got three powers here, China, France, and United States. And when it comes to the mineral resources, you got the continent of Africa and United States. What I was interested in is, what about the continent of Latin America, Australia, elsewhere? So I think it's one of many series. I hope you'll do more. It's brilliant.
Well, thank you very much. I work for the Bertelsmann Foundation. I'm the director of Bertelsmann Foundation Documentaries. So that's who funds it. And this gives me a chance to plug us. You can find all our films online for free at bfnadocs.org. I think one thing that makes us a good thing, similar to the Council of the Americas, is that we're really just pushing for honest conversation. We don't have any sort of skin in the game. We're not trying to say something is 100% bad or good. We're really just trying to talk about this, and because of that, there's a really strong amount of independence in our work, which is something that we appreciate. And you're right, I mean, I had to accept early on with this film that we weren't going to be able to cover everything. And in some ways that was a relief, because in the early days when it was like people were texting me, they found lithium in Mongolia, and I'm like, I can't do it all. But so we just tried to find examples. And we will probably continue working on this issue. I think another thing we're going to do is make these sections a little longer and make a series of, this is the Latin America section as a standalone film, and this is the Indonesia section as a standalone film. Because you're right, this is by no means comprehensive. So it's finding a balance of what can we tell in the time period. Any thoughts on the global nature of it?
You covered it real well. It's good stuff.
Thanks for those great questions. In the back there? I think, yes. If we can get the mic.
Hi, thanks for this film. I think it's really particularly striking how you showed how these great power politics and these large multinational corporations, what it means when the rubber hits the road for these local communities. So I was curious, in the different cases that you looked at, there were different ways of reconciling with the grievances of these local communities, everything from payments to workforce development programs in the case of Dunkirk. So I was wondering, what lessons would you learn for but maybe more sustainable and more community-centered interactions with what are essentially dependent on specific areas of the world and natural resource extraction?
Yeah, that's such an excellent question, and that's one of the things that I benefit from being a documentary filmmaker and going that route, is I get to mostly focus on the problems and don't offer a whole lot of solutions. But the question is, what is a sustainable relationship? And if you are making payments, what is enough payments, and what's the best practice for making them? And is that what's really important, or is creating job opportunities most important? And I mean, my takeaway is just how divided these places are. And that's what I really tried to pull out of the film. So getting back to, it's not like there's a good guy or bad guy. When you go to the native tribe in northern Nevada, you have some people that are furious about it and think that's destroying their sacred land, but then you have an equal amount of people who view it as an economic lifeline. And that's something that I saw repeatedly. When you go to Chile, you have people that are very thankful to have the community benefits, and you have people who are against it. When you go to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you have people that say, yeah, it's not a great job, but at least it's a job. I would have loved to be a teacher, but that wasn't open to me. So, I mean, I think that's the riddle. And I think that's what we need to navigate. And I think what the goal with the film is to bring that riddle to your attention. So it's an unsatisfying answer for you. I don't know the answer. But if anything, if it can help to understand more the dilemmas that, the cell phones that we cannot put down cause.
If I can add, I think there's another key piece here, and it was touched on in the film. It wasn't actually drawn out so much, but it was touched on. There was a placeholder. I can't remember if it was the Bolivia or the Chile piece, where you had an interviewee who was talking about, she didn't use the word, I'll use it, disillusionment, the promises that were made by government that were not kept. And there's a fundamental disconnect in Latin America, and I suspect in other parts of the world as well, where you get a company in good faith, negotiating a contract in good faith with a government, which may be negotiating in good faith, but the government is at the federal national level in the capital. And let's say Lima, Peru. But the mine is nowhere clear, nowhere close to Lima. And it's the local officials that determine the local conditions, right? And if the money that's paid to the national government doesn't get to the local government, or does so in a way that's not transparent, or doesn't focus on the priorities that were promised, you get a community that rapidly feels taken advantage of. Because the promises were made, they're not kept, somebody's getting wealthy, but it ain't them. And so where's this disconnect? And oftentimes, because they're an easy target, oftentimes the international community, the international company is targeted and say, you're exploiting our land, we're not getting anything from it. When in fact, the disconnect is in the local government. It's in their own government. And the government's lack of capacity, the government, sometimes there's corruption involved. The government sometimes is just an inability to conduct affairs the way that you might anticipate in other countries. And so there's a real problem here. And so how do you address that? I don't know, but it's structural. And every single time, not every single time, but more times than I can count, when I've been involved in these sorts of issues in Latin America, there is that disconnect because the federal government negotiates the contracts that have to be executed at the local level, and there is just not that level of, that connectivity, and it's the local folks who feel aggrieved, and then they protest, and then the mines call on the government to meet the terms of the contract, right? And then you get the police out, and it degenerates from there. And it becomes a really complicated scenario when, if in fact, the original promises that had been made were kept, presumably much of that agita, much of those problems would be avoided.
Yeah.
Great point. Why don't we, let's see, I'm trying to remember the order here. Here on the left, and then we'll try to get in a couple more questions.
Great, thank you, and thank you so much for this film. I know you had to try to pack a lot in, and maybe couldn't cover obviously everything. One thing I was hoping to see, and I'm curious if you considered it, or what you heard about it, is the opportunity for second life use of batteries. It's kind of another piece in that circularity chain. We've seen some promising developments here in the United States with utility companies seeking to use some batteries as part of grid support. There's an industry developing in Sweden. I mean, these are just examples, but did you hear about that? Was that just, something?
So by second life, you mean if I'm done with my battery, I give it and
it's no longer,
it's not recycled, but it's
a step in the process, and then the next step would be to go to recycling, but it's another way to, to use the power, for instance, in really more so in vehicles, I'd say, be able to continue to get benefit from the minerals and decrease the demand upstream.
No, I really can't say anything about that. I know it's going to become a fundamentally important issue because if you think about it, these electric vehicle batteries, we're only coming sort of now-ish to when those first EV cars are going to be no longer useful. And so now you do have this problem with these batteries, and if you don't figure out a solution for them, it's going to end up in a landfill, and that's going to be very dangerous. But I can't specifically speak to that. It sounds like, I bet there's any number of businesses that realize this opportunity to do something with the batteries that are no longer of use to the consumer, to the first consumer.
It's your next film.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Right at the end of the documentary, they were saying, this is a race that's just beginning. And I found myself thinking, I think this is a race that's already been run. I mean, 80% of cobalt from DRC, 70% of processing in mining in China, 70% of lithium from the lithium triangle in South America. I feel like it's almost, I mean, this is a race that took decades to run, and it has been run, is my sense. And I think it's almost like 0% chance that the United States inverts those numbers and processes 90% of any of these critical minerals. So I'm wondering, in the way that China clearly identified there was an opportunity to leapfrog the rest of the developed world, is there something that we haven't thought of that, maybe it's solid state batteries, sodium ion or something, or that the US is like, let's just abandon lithium ion? Maybe there's something even better out there that we could just leapfrog that doesn't require maybe any of these critical minerals. And maybe, I'm curious if that came up in your research at all.
A wonderful question, And also, you're not the first person that made that point that maybe this race is already over, which I think would be very troubling to a lot of people, but may be the fact. And you're right. There is no guarantee that ultimately the battery that we will use for the next century of energy will be the lithium battery. There are definitely people trying to make a different kind of battery. And when I learned that, the first thing I said was, can you please wait for me to finish this documentary? Because you will cause me a big problem. I was like, go ahead and do it, just wait a little bit. And so, yes, maybe that's what it comes down to. And I think something you also, and I'm glad you mentioned some of those numbers that I think is so important to remember, is that refining step. That is a major step. One thing is getting them, or we can say, well, France is a success story because they're making a battery. But even to make that battery, they're importing those those refined minerals from China. And that's something you say, okay, well, why don't we just tariff the heck out of China? The problem is we don't really have that capacity. The whole reason the problem is there to begin with is because at this moment, we don't have the capacity, as I understand it, to do that domestically. And it can take a long time to develop. I'm sure both of you know.
And there's a lag time to develop, exactly.
Years, right? I mean,
Absolutely. I know you've been patient in the back there, second to the last row, I think it is. Right there? Yes, go ahead.
The Trump administration recently signed an executive order focusing on domestic production of critical minerals. It's anticipated that they're going to have another executive order later on regarding more of an international approach. I'm wondering if you have any sense about what you think they will do, what they should do, if the desire is to try to have more of the processing and the mining done in the United States, whether it is minerals that are processed here or mined here. What do you think the next approach of the Trump administration is going to be with their subsequent executive order on this?
You want to take a crack at that one?
Well, it's a great question. I think a couple things. First of all, in the broader scope, clearly the administration is trying to incentivize production in the United States. The thing about mining is you got to go where the product is. And it could be in the US, but it could be somewhere else. It could be in Canada, Australia, it could be in Bolivia. And so that's, by definition, a complication. Having said that, if we're sticking with lithium as the conversation for this evening, there are massive new finds of lithium in the United States, and one of them was highlighted here. There are others as well. Canada wasn't mentioned, but there's a whole lot of lithium in Canada. There's lithium in Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. So, it depends on, how aggressive it is, but you can do a lot of things to incentivize things like exploration and production of natural resources in your own territory. And the administration, as I understand it, is doing that on, for example, oil and gas and drilling and things like that. So, it's tax incentives. It's opening federal lands up to exploration. It's, infrastructure that the government might pay for that, others can use. There's all kinds of things along those lines. And there's also the whole tariffs question too, right? So if you're going to tariff something from overseas, by definition, it's going to become more expensive, and it will incentivize production to the extent possible in the US. And my sense is that is where the administration's head is in the current moment. Having said that, I think Sam points to a very important reality, and that's that there is a choke point on processing, and it's the Chinese choke point, and it's been very strategic. You're not going to break that overnight. But I do think that that is part of the answer, is the diversification about, adding value that doesn't have to go through a Chinese, doesn't have to necessarily touch China in the supply chain, although, you can't back out 100%. So it's a super complicated topic, but I think that the administration is going to have to find their way forward. It's interesting to note, though, that, if you're putting tariffs on products like copper, 40% of the global copper is what? Chile, and a bunch is in Peru, the top two, producers in the world. You need copper for all kinds of things, not just, energy transition and clean energy and these sorts of things. And so, by adding tariffs at the front end, you're increasing costs through the entire supply chain, making it a whole lot more complicated to do the production in the United States, with the imports from overseas. So I guess my sense is the administration's been in office for a couple months, as we saw from the tariff suspension announcement today. Some of the things that are announced are changeable, and so we don't really know. But we're going to have to watch it closely. I would simply say that.
Great to have so many good questions. I know we're a little over time, so maybe just
Let's take this one in the back.
this one in the back, and we'll conclude there.
Thank you very much for producing the film, directing the film. The race may be over, but the approach has been the same for many centuries. And I think you touched on the approach with regards to the aspects of the disconnects between federal and local. The approach with regards to transparency. I thought you did a good job. I took away from the documentary the piece where you had the indigenous people not being allowed access to the very facilities that they were delivering the products to. The moniker of rare earth is, these minerals and materials, they're rare, but in actuality, they are commodities to the point that was made earlier. They are ubiquitous. It's just that we haven't located them, we haven't sensed them, but they are also here in ample quantity in this country. And I just wanted to know if you could expound a bit more on the differences you came away with in how developed economies or developed countries like France dealt with their approach as opposed to lesser developed countries and nations.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, and I agree with a lot of what you said. And I think that one of the things that's interesting for me is to see precisely how different countries respond and where the clashes are, because from the United States perspective, they need these minerals and they need them now, and they want to go down and get them, and because they're in this competition with China. But from the country's perspective, just as you said, a lot of them have been experiencing this for centuries, and that really is a scar on their psyche. I mean, in no place more so than in Bolivia, but it's also the case in parts of Africa where they have had the materials that have developed the rest of the world and made the rest of the world rich, while somehow they continue to be very poor, and they really don't want that to happen again. So the psyches, there's a clash there. There's the United States are just so excited, let's get it, let's do it. Or China doing the same thing, but that's competing against, we can't let this happen again. We can't let this opportunity slip through our hands. It was interesting because it wasn't even like in Bolivia they were saying no more. They weren't saying that. They weren't saying no more commodities, we're done with it. I mean, some people are saying it, but that's not the general feeling. The general feeling was more, there's gotta be a way we can do this where some of this money stays here. And that, I think, is the scars of centuries. And so what do we see in this, though, is where are these jobs being created? You see these, and you mentioned this earlier, further down the production stream, the better jobs, the ones that are more professional, are occurring in places like France and also in the United States. That's something we filmed but didn't have time to put in this film. There's a lot of job creation, especially in the American South, around EV stuff. Those are good jobs. It's a good story for America. I mean, of course, there's always complications, but you are seeing this idea of, once again, the minerals being yanked out of the ground over there and maybe creating better jobs and money over here.
If I could add just a couple points quickly, I think when the whole Bolivia lithium boom was starting, and if I recall accurately, it was about 10, maybe 15 years ago, and they were starting to negotiate contracts. I said at the time, and I can't prove this because I didn't write it down, so maybe you think I'm making it up, but that's actually true. Kezia was with me at the time, so you can vouch for me. But I said at the time, negotiate the contract for lithium, but make sure that you also negotiate it for battery technology, right? If you're going to be China, you're going to get the Chinese money and investment, fine. Where's the research and development for battery technology? On the ground, in Bolivia, with Bolivian engineers that are trained, that are educated, right? And so you build that local capacity, and of course what happened? None of that happened. But you know, it's not like there's a magic bullet here. We've seen this movie before. Yeah. It's just people don't pursue that, and they say it's easier just to sell the raw material. What they should be doing is selling the ecosystem, and you know, in selling the ability to move up that value chain. But in order to do that, it's going to take a massive amount of investment on, as I mentioned, education, but also research and development. Latin America broadly, not just Bolivia, but broadly, has the lowest level of research and development worldwide by orders of magnitude, other than Southern Africa. And so, you know, how do you compete against a China or against an EU or against North America if the percentage of your local economy, of your GDP that you're devoting to research and development is orders of magnitude lower than everybody else? I mean, how are you going to, where are you going to develop in a global knowledge-based economy? And how are you going to take advantage of the products that you yourself have, but now somebody else is going to get the value from? So I think that's point number one. The second one is, you use the word, but I think it's absolutely critical. The word is transparency, right? The more that your citizens can see what you're doing in an open process where, you know, you're not getting contracts or bids that are, you know, behind the scenes or quiet or closed off, where there are no special deals, none of that. It's an open and it's sunlit process, but then you have to have a rule of law so that you can actually enforce these things, so that if somebody's taking advantage or not abiding by the terms of the contracts, you can hold them to account. And that's the piece that so many countries just fall down on. And it's not because they want to, it's because it's a capacity question, right? How do you enforce, you know, a law or a regulation with a global company, which is very sophisticated, in a contract that may have been negotiated by a politician who isn't there anymore, who, you know, and under terms that were murky at best. And so you're a local judge, and he or she, you know, you're not trained in business. How do you even begin to adjudicate that type of case? And you get so many problems in that scenario. And then people say, well, the company's taking advantage of us. Well, but where's the rule of law? And so this is the question that you just have to grapple with. They're not easy questions on the ground. They're complicated, they're messy, and they lead to a lot of misunderstandings and miscommunications. But I think the more that the process could be transparent, and that people know what they're getting into, and the local communities can see what the trade-offs are, ultimately, I think that's one of the answers for longevity and success of some of these projects.
Well, as you point out at the beginning of the documentary, the geology dictates that we have to engage with places around the world that are politically risky, much like the oil industry, places that aren't easy to do business, and perhaps with governments that lack that kind of capacity. This has been a great discussion, and I've been honored to be here. Thank you. Any final words, Sam?
No, just that it's really a pleasure, and I appreciate it, and I encourage you to check out our films at Bertelsmann Foundation Documentaries at bfnadocs.org. Please do, and then thank you to you both.
Thank you.